thanks to Margaret and to the Sierra Club for inviting me tonight. This was a really great setup. I'm going to really try to pick up on things that Alex said. In particular, there's this idea that what the Trump administration, what any government owes, is to do something that would really help, would really prevent the harm that is coming to his generation. But he also mentioned Bill McKibben's 350 limit, 350 parts per million. And I don't know how many people in here really follow this closely and know that we passed 400 a year ago, right? So what it means to really protect his generation is to do something far more drastic than anyone in politics is talking about. And so what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about really aggressive climate solutions. And I'm an academic, so I know that this is probably a group that's very activist-oriented, and I'll try to be like exciting. But I'm going to give you a lot of data in a really cool, interesting way, I promise. And I'm a philosopher by training, and so I work as a bioethicist now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the data that supports, I think, a really powerful moral argument. Now, I'm going to say up front that this moral argument is really uncomfortable, and I get that. And I'm going to say right now, just to be totally transparent, I got a kid. Right? I have a 3-year-old at home, so the title is Towards a Small Family Size in the Age of Climate Change. Notice that that title is not I Hate Babies. Okay? I'm a big fan of kids. So let's just get that out in the open. Okay. I'm an academic, so this is what we do. We say I'm going to tell you this, right? So here's the thing that makes me a little bit of a downer. To motivate the sort of conversation that I need us to have, I've got to scare you a little bit. And this community probably knows all the basics, so I normally have point 1 above all these, which is the basics of climate science. That's what I have to teach my students. But I'm going to skip that part because I assume that a lot of you know, and I'm happy to talk more during Q&A. So instead I'm going to jump straight to the scary part, which is the kind of state-of-the-art in modeling and climate projections, and the sorts of things that do not make good stories on The Guardian, because the editors are like, you have to give us hope. Well, there's hope that we don't end all humanity. But that's not hope that we're going to avoid all harm, right? So I'm going to scare you a little bit, and then I'm going to try to make an argument about what we should do in the light of that. So I'm going to do this quick, and I promise I will stay around as long as anyone wants to if you want to talk more about it. This is a bunch of data, and if you're not a data person, don't worry. But what this is from a World Bank report that was commissioned by the Potsdam Institute, one of the leading climate think tanks in the world. And what it shows is something really terrifying that does not get told in the kind of public consciousness. What Alex wants us to do, what he has a right that we do, is to follow this trajectory into the future where we are likely to never cross 2 degrees Celsius warming global average temperature rise. This red line is the path that we're on. The black line we don't want to talk about because it's possible. That's the business as usual. That's if we all decide that we're much more like some current politicians than we are like activists. That's what happens. So to put numbers to it, we're supposed to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. Bill McKibben and folks who say 350 is the correct atmospheric concentration. We should really stay below 1.5 degrees temperature rise, 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're aiming at 3.7. That's the current policy projections. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Given that we're aiming at close to 4 in a business as usual future until 2100 has us at almost 5 degrees Celsius, here's a really, really important question to ask. What happens at 4 degrees Celsius, right? At 2 degrees Celsius, lots of people talk about that. Sea level rise, that's really scary. Droughts, food insecurity, hunger, water stress, severe water stress, changing disease vectors, right? Zika is not supposed to be in New York, guys, right? This is not supposed to happen if we had a normal climate. So what happens at 4 degrees? Again, a little bit sciencey for anyone intimidated by that, but this is really easy to understand. I'm going to pick one piece of what happens at 4 degrees, just heat. Just heat. I'm not going to talk about dying from dehydration, food insecurity, and hunger, and changing disease vectors, right? Just brutal heat in parts of the world that are already hot. What happens at 4 degrees Celsius is that 3 sigma events, which is just a fancy science way of saying events that are 3 standard deviations from the norm, which is still a fancy way of saying highly unusual events at present. These are events that have what we call a recurrence time of about 740 years. So you do not expect these to happen very often. At 4 degrees, these are the norm. Extreme monthly heat, the kind of heat wave that would have your meteorologist saying, this isn't going to happen again for 1,000 years. That is the normal summer heat at 4 degrees Celsius. But then there are these other things. There are these 5 sigma events, 5 standard deviations from the norm for you math heads, right? These are essentially absent at present. The recurrence time is millions of years. 5 sigma events have almost guaranteed to have never happened on the human time scale. They'll be common. 5 sigma events will be deadly heat in the Middle East, North Africa, Mediterranean. Right? Anyone notice the heat dome that settled over the Middle East a couple summers ago? Right? The heat index, they call it the wet bulb index, right, was 165 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 days. That was not a 5 sigma event. That was a 3 sigma event. Right? 5 sigma events can kill you by walking outside. So why is there any optimism at all, given this projection, right? This room probably doesn't have a lot of optimism. But I'm going to tell you a couple reasons why. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, actually said we can avoid 2 degrees Celsius warming. We can. They have lots of resources, lots of computing power, lots of scientists, and so they ran 700 mitigation scenarios. And they had the kitchen sink approach. My co-authors and I call it the consensus approach, which is you do it all, and you do it now, immediately, all at once, deeply decarbonize, right? And there's still a 33% chance that we cross 2 degrees Celsius. Much more scary than, I'm sorry for this, I hear the sigh, I'm sorry, I'm such a downer. No one ever invites me back. Okay, so what's really disconcerting about this is the assumptions that are built in. So here are a few of them. We had to start immediately, and this report was in 2014 already. So we're already pretty screwed on the time frame part, but we're obviously not making any serious inroads. But much, much more distressing than that, so some people in here from an environmental bent, anyone got worries about nuclear power? Anyone concerned? Yeah. All of these models assume that we ramp up nuclear power at least 300%. Right? All right, a little bit more distressing than that even, all of these models require, they're built in, that we can only achieve a 67% chance of not crossing 2 degrees Celsius if we have scalable carbon capture and storage technology. Which we don't have, we haven't invented it yet. We don't know if we can. If we can, we're a couple decades away, say some leading experts, right? But the problem is, they're assuming that we can suck more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than we pump out in a given year, so that we actually decrease atmospheric carbon, right? We just don't know if that's possible, and it's built into the models. What about the Paris Agreement, someone might say? Didn't we solve this problem? I'm not going to spend a lot of time except to say, it's just not anywhere near good enough. And everyone was very excited, and I wanted to be excited. I really, really did. If every country in the world adhered to their purely voluntary, non-binding pledges, the Earth would warm 2.9 to 3.4 degrees. Also, we have this little problem that nobody has strategies for achieving their pledges. Obama had a pretty good one, mostly because the economy was going to do it for him. But the Clean Power Plan, what's going on with the Clean Power Plan, Alex? Roll it back, right? So we're actively undermining the really small incremental changes that could have helped us achieve these woefully inadequate pledges. I think Alex did a pretty good job talking about climate change is already causing harm. Looking to the real immediate future, the WHO estimates that just a few of the climate-related harms are going to kill 250,000 people a year in the years between 2030 and 2050. That's probably even before we hit the 2 degrees Celsius warming. We'll have already locked it in, but we haven't hit it. And so our current proposals simply just don't mitigate fast enough to avoid that. What all this means, right, add it together, what all this means is that by 2030 to 2050, we're only getting the heat rays that we're locking in right now, and it's already going to commit us to 250,000 deaths a year just from some of the modest harms of climate change. Diarrheal disease is one of the big ones. Right? It actually doesn't count for air pollution, because then it would be in the millions. My conclusion from all of this is that we need truly aggressive climate policy options. Now, I'm actually not going to talk about a whole bunch of policy here, but this is at the level of structure, that we're just not doing anything like enough. And so my interim conclusions at this point is that we're not on anything like a path to prevent dangerous climate change, and we're not actually even on a path right now to prevent catastrophic climate change. Right? We're still aiming at that 4 degrees Celsius. We need something else. If we're going to keep our promise, if we make one, to Alex's generation and some of you all's generation, we have to do something really uncomfortable, because everything that we talked about isn't enough. So here's something really uncomfortable. Let's talk about world population. This is an accurate graph, by the way. It's a kind of cartoon coloring, but this is what global population demographics look like. It took all of human history up to the 1800s to make our first billion. Anyone know how many years it took to make our last billion? 11, 12, yeah. 1,000 years. What was that? 11, 12 to make the last one, right? Hundreds of thousands of years to make the first. So here's the standard argument for climate change that references population, right? Here's how it goes. Too much carbon in the atmosphere. We got an all-time anthropogenic carbon budget of 1 trillion tons. We got way too much. We're getting there too fast. So we must either adapt to a changing world, or the answer is and mitigate by modifying our practices. And then somebody brings up population and says, but by 2050, we'll have 9 or 10 billion people instead of 7.4. So the answer is, we have to really modify our practices to make space for 2 to 3 billion more people, right? So I'm trained as a logician, so I can promise you that this is a good inference. There's another option, right? There's conceptual space in the argument, and that is that instead of just talking about per capita emissions as the sort of variable that we could target, that we could think about as malleable, we could talk about the number of capitas, right? Not just the size of your carbon footprint, the number of footprints. So totally unsurprisingly, greenhouse gases in the developed world raised in 1-to-1 correlation with population. This is not shocking. So this is what aggressive climate action looks like. We not only need a lower per capita emissions rate, we need fewer capitas. We need fewer people making less carbon, right? Okay, so you might say to me totally justifiably, we clearly need something else. Why do you think population would help at all? I'm going to give you 2 answers. I'm going to answer at the individual level. If anyone in this room is thinking about having kids, right, they think I might have to deliberate about whether or not to have kids, I'm going to give you an answer for you, for your deliberation, and I'm going to give you a structural sort of answer. All right. So when I first started working on this issue several years ago, I really wondered what the carbon impact of making a baby was. This was really relevant because I'd been married for almost 10 years and it kind of felt like maybe that was coming. And so I wanted to know, like, what am I responsible for at this time? And I finally found one study, and it's become a very big study in the literature, but these guys, Murtaugh and Schlacks, out in the Pacific Northwest, published a really important paper on the carbon legacy of making babies. And what they found is that you can take 6 of the most kind of common green activities, and all of us in here are probably environmentalists, so all the things that you know you're obligated to do. You have to recycle, you have to invest in energy efficient appliances, you do not get to drive the Hummer, you should decrease your commute time, right? All these things. You add up all 6 of those, right? And every time you don't make a baby, you save more than 20 times of the summed lifetime total of those activities. You can put that another way, procreating swamps everything else you could ever do. I mean, this isn't true for some people, like if you're Donald Trump, you build buildings and fly planes, whatever, right? But his kids are gonna do it too, so it's probably still true. So the reason this works, right? The reason this works is because you are not responsible nearly for a bunch of extra diapers. You're responsible for the fact that you've made new agents who are gonna emit, and they're gonna make new agents who are gonna emit. And you don't get all the responsibility because you had some help in making that new baby, and then you had some help in, the lineage that's gonna make more babies, but you have some bit of responsibility for your entire descendant. So you sit on top of an iceberg of future emissions, and you get some responsibility for it. So in their math, every time you make a baby, you basically increase your carbon footprint by about 6 times, your lifetime carbon footprint. So that's a pretty big deal. Could it matter at the global scale? If lots of people decided to do this, could this make a difference? That seems like an important thing to know. So Brian O'Neill and his colleagues several years ago decided to try to answer this question, and they found that reducing fertility from the median projection in the UN population projections to the low projection, which is about a fertility decrease of 0.5 child per woman on average globally. So it's not huge. They estimate that it could be done entirely by giving women access to family planning services, providing education and healthcare, right? If you did that, by 2100, you annually save over 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide, right? Carbon, actually, sorry. I know that number doesn't mean much in isolation, so here's how to think about it. In 2013, emissions were a little under 10 billion. So by 2100, we could every year save more than half of our total annual emissions. To put it another way, if we're still holding on to this pipe dream that we can avoid 2 degrees Celsius for our next generation, this could account for 16 to 29% of the savings that are required to avoid 2 degrees Celsius warming. That could make a dent. All right, so interim conclusion 2 is that population is an important variable, and that's because it might be necessary. We're kind of screwed without it, first part, right? And it could make a significant impact. So what? So here's where the philosopher comes out. So far there hasn't been much philosophy, right? There's been hanging out with demographers and climate scientists for the most part. The so what goes like this. There's a challenge to individual morality. So some of you might be thinking like, well look, maybe that's true, right? But the one kid that I have just does not make a difference, right? This is a collective problem, and so we need a collective solution. I think about this, because I'm a bioethicist, as a kind of tension between collective policy level bioethics and individual bioethics. I do work on the policy side. I've got a paper out with some colleagues from Georgetown, Jake Earl and Colin Hickey, and so if you're interested, we can talk about that. I'm very interested in the policy side. How could we actually get to a world where we reduce the population? Not going to talk about that today, but I want to talk about something else. Even if we don't have a policy solution, could you have a moral burden to reduce your family size because of the emissions impacts? That's the moral philosophy question. So here's my question back to you. Since I only have a few minutes, I'm really just raising the question, and we can chat all night if you want. There's places to drink around here, right? I mean, okay. So here's the question. Don't you all sometimes think that you have an obligation to do something that by itself means virtually nothing? Like recycle, like increase fuel efficiency, like avoiding wastefulness, right? My point here is what a philosopher would call an argument by analogy. We're already committed to some moral principle or set of moral principles that show that we can be individually obligated to do things that are only a part of a collective solution. As a matter of fact, I think you all have to recycle even if everyone else is saying trash the planet, which is kind of the situation we're in, right? So if you believe that, well, now we go back to what I said before, that making a baby is the most impactful thing that you could possibly do. So if you've got an obligation to do these really, really lightweight things, like recycle and increase fuel efficiency, do you not inherit any moral reason at all to do the thing that would make the biggest single impact that you could? It's a rhetorical question. I clearly think that there's a reason there. Okay, so that's about as far as I get to go with philosophy in a 25-minute talk, right? So I'm gonna tell you where this leads me. I've got a small book out, but none of you should buy it because it's priced ridiculously. So I'll tell you the Cliff's Notes version, right? If we don't find a new way to address climate change, we simply can't avoid massive amounts of harm. It's coming because we've locked it in and we just don't care enough clearly. Slowing population growth and eventually reversing the population could reduce this harm significantly. So that numbers from O'Neill, right? And in our individual lives, we already accept the kind of moral principles that could take us from that realization that reducing the population matters morally to the conclusion that I have an individual obligation to do the part that I can, right? So since procreation is the biggest contribution we can make, it seems plausible that it ought to be part of this calculus. So there appears to be good reason, now I'm going to make a caveat here, not saying overriding reason. There appears to be good reason to refrain from procreating. I started off the talk by saying I have a baby, so there better be more to this, right? Okay. Here's food for thought. Does anyone in here think that having a child is just like one of the most meaningful things you could possibly do in the world? Anyone? A few people? I'll say it. I'll say it, dang it. I'll raise my hand. All right. Not everyone believes this, and if you don't, you probably ought not to have a kid, says the argument, right? But some of us say that this is life-giving, meaning-giving, identity-altering stuff. And you might get a protection for some of that sort of thing. If you're a lifelong pacifist, I might not be able to obligate you to murder somebody for the greater good, right? So it seems unlikely to me that morality could require that we remain childless forever. That just doesn't mean that morality remains silent on the issue. Here's a fact about me. I did something for my good, and you all are paying for it. And that matters. It matters to the things I do in the future. I inherited a responsibility. And now, if my wife and I are thinking, should we have a second one? The stakes go up. We got that great good for ourselves already, right? At a very, very minimum, if you're like looking at me sideways thinking, you are crazy, man, at a minimum, here's what it suggests. Our defaults on this whole situation are totally backwards. Because in our society, here's the thing that's somehow allowed to happen. A woman says that she doesn't have a kid and she looks like she's in her 30s, and we feel like we might actually be able to say, well, don't you want kids? Why don't you have any kids? So my argument calls bullshit, right? And basically, sorry, am I allowed to say that at the Sierra Club? Okay. The default that we can question whether or not you remain childless and what your justification is, but that we're not allowed to ask the people who have children what their justification is, has it exactly backwards. I've got a kid, and it's on me to justify it to you why I did that. I've got to stand up to the demand for reasons that the argument gives. Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm going to do the rest of the time to listen.